Was Christmas morning, a day meant for laughter, warmth, and the quiet glow of twinkling lights. Yet, for Clara, every decoration, every carefully wrapped gift felt like a cruel joke. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly, heart pounding as her husband, Mark, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that cut deeper than any knife. "You really thought I'd stick around for this," he said, his voice laced with amusement, not concern. "A baby, a holiday, and all you've got is a secret you think I don't see." Clara's eyes widened, but she said nothing. She had kept her mother's secret for years. Her mother, the woman who had raised her alone, had always been shrouded in mystery. No one knew the truth, not even Mark, that the woman who had recently passed away wasn't just any mother. She had been a billionaire. And now, with her death, Clara had inherited more than she could have ever imagined. But Mark didn't care about legacies or fortunes. He only saw opportunity, his opportunity to humiliate, to dominate, to destroy. Pulling a crisp envelope from the mantel, he tossed it onto the carpet with a deliberate flourish. "Divorce papers," he said, laughing softly, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Merry Christmas, Clara." Time seemed to slow. Clara felt the weight of the world pressing down on her chest, her stomach tightening not just from pregnancy, but from shock. The man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her life, had chosen this day, the day meant for miracles, for family, for love, to shatter her world. And yet, beneath the crushing despair, a spark ignited. A tiny, defiant flame that whispered promises of justice, of revenge, of life reclaimed. He thought he had all the power, but he had no idea what he was really dealing with. Because the secret Clara carried, both in her heart and in the inheritance she had never yet revealed, was about to turn everything upside down. Christmas would no longer be a day of warmth. It would be the day her world burned, the day a husband's cruelty collided with a fortune he never even knew existed. And Clara, trembling yet unbroken, would rise from the ashes in a way he could never anticipate. The envelope on the floor wasn't just paper. It was the beginning of a reckoning, and it was only the first of many shocking twists that would change her life forever. Before the cruel twist of Christmas and the betrayal that shattered her world, Clara's life had been quietly ordinary, modest, even mundane, but filled with small, tender moments that made each day feel alive. She lived in a cozy apartment nestled on a quiet street, the kind of place where neighbors exchanged nods and children's laughter drifted through open windows. Her furniture wasn't expensive, her wardrobe was simple, and every meal she cooked carried the love she poured into it rather than the price tag on its ingredients. Mark had been the center of her world, at least until that day. He wasn't cruel by nature, at least not always, but he was distracted, often oblivious to the quiet sacrifices she made. He worked long hours in an office she sometimes imagined as sterile and unfeeling, and though he smiled, joked, and held her hand in public, there was a distance in his eyes she had learned to ignore. She had convinced herself it was enough. Love, after all, didn't always come wrapped in perfect attentiveness. Clara's days were a delicate balance of routines. Morning coffee brewed while watching the sun spill gold over the rooftops. Long walks where she imagined the life she wanted for her child. Evenings spent with Mark discussing plans for a future she hoped would be stable. Her pregnancy had brought new dreams. A nursery painted soft pastel, tiny socks folded neatly in drawers, lullabies she hummed with a trembling voice. Every heartbeat in her womb felt like a promise, every flutter a reminder that life could be tender even when it was fragile. And yet, behind the ordinary, there was always the shadow of her mother's legacy, a secret she had been sworn to protect. Her mother had lived quietly, a woman of immense wealth who had chosen to remain invisible in the world, a ghost among ordinary lives. Clara had grown up in this delicate balance, understanding the value of simplicity while carrying a secret that could have upended everything if revealed. Her friends admired her resilience, her gentle humor, her ability to light up a room with warmth rather than extravagance. She had dreams, two small ones, careful ones. Perhaps a little home in the suburbs, a garden where her child could run freely, a life filled with laughter that wasn't tethered to bills or deadlines. She believed she could have it all in a quiet, unassuming way. And yet, in retrospect, it was all so fragile. The love she clung to, the safety she believed she had built, the ordinary life she cherished, all of it rested on foundations no one could see. The world she thought she understood was about to fracture, and the secrets she had held so carefully were poised to explode in ways she could never have anticipated. Because the ordinary life she treasured was only the surface. Beneath it lay a wealth, a power, a force that Mark had no inkling existed. And when that hidden world collided with her humdrum reality, Clara's quiet existence would be forever changed. Clara had always known her mother was extraordinary, but the truth was beyond anything she could have imagined. The woman who had raised her alone, who had worked tirelessly and lived with quiet dignity, was not merely wealthy. She was a secret trillionaire. Every detail of her life had been carefully curated, every act of generosity subtle, almost invisible, leaving the world unaware of her staggering fortune. To those outside the family, she was an enigma. A philanthropist here, a silent donor there, never claiming the spotlight, never letting the wealth define her. Her mother had believed in living quietly, teaching Clara that true power was in humility, kindness, and discretion. They had never stayed in flashy hotels, never flaunted luxury, and yet Clara had grown up surrounded by comforts others could only dream of. The mansion they had called home in childhood was unremarkable from the outside, blending into the suburban street, but inside it was a labyrinth of secrets. Rooms filled with priceless art, shelves stacked with rare books, hidden vaults that hinted at unimaginable riches. Her mother had always insisted these things were meant to be used wisely, not flaunted recklessly. What stunned Clara most wasn't the numbers, the unimaginable scale of her inheritance. It was the purpose behind it. Her mother had spent decades quietly shaping a world of opportunity for others, supporting orphanages in remote corners, funding medical breakthroughs, preserving endangered lands. Every fortune she had quietly accumulated was a thread in a tapestry of generosity and foresight. She had built not just wealth, but a legacy that could transform lives. And now, with her mother gone, Clara held the key to it all. The weight of that secret pressed against her chest, heavier than any envelope of divorce papers Mark could throw at her. For the first time, she understood the true magnitude of the life she had led. The ordinary existence she had believed was all she would ever have. Everything she had known, every small dream, every ordinary day, had been built on foundations of hidden power and opportunity. Yet the revelation was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Wealth of such scale was a magnet for greed, betrayal, and danger. It could bring freedom, yes, but also scrutiny, envy, and threats she had never imagined. Mark, the man who had mocked and humiliated her, had no idea the life he sought to destroy was just a fragment of what she truly commanded. The scales of fortune had shifted overnight, and with it, the rules of her world. As Clara stared at the photographs, ledgers, and secret correspondences her mother had left behind, a cold determination began to take root. The life she had once feared losing, the one her husband thought he controlled, was hers to reclaim, reshape, and protect. But with power came peril, and every choice now carried consequences far beyond her ordinary imagination. The question loomed: how would she navigate a world where everything she had been, and everything she thought she was owed, had just been redefined? Clara's heart still raced from the morning's chill, the room now heavy with the scent of pine and cinnamon, a cruel irony against the bitterness in the air. Mark lounged on the armchair, casual and calm, as if the envelope on the carpet had been no more than a holiday card. He sipped his coffee with deliberate slowness, eyes tracing her trembling form with a detached amusement that made her skin crawl. "You're taking this too seriously," he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's just paperwork, nothing personal." Nothing personal. The words sank into her like shards of glass. Everything about this moment was personal. Everything about him had always been personal. The way he had smiled when she announced her pregnancy, the way he had held her hand in public, the way he had whispered promises of love and care late at night. And now, every memory was a lie, every gesture tainted by mockery. Clara pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the life inside her stir, a small heartbeat she was determined to protect. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice to a taunting whisper. "You really thought I'd stick around for this? A baby, a holiday, and a secret inheritance you think I don't know about? How quaint." She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. He had reduced the life she carried, the dreams she had nurtured, to a joke. The husband she had trusted had become a predator, preying on her vulnerability at the exact moment she was most exposed. Clara's mind raced, replaying the conversation in fragmented bursts. His laughter cruel and deliberate, the envelope he had tossed as if it were a toy. The way he had leaned back, unconcerned, waiting for her reaction. She remembered every detail, the sharp tilt of his brow, the mock sympathy in his eyes, the way the morning light caught the smirk that had become a weapon. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to dissolve into tears that seemed too heavy to carry. Yet beneath the hurt, a flicker of clarity ignited. This was not just cruelty, it was underestimation. He had assumed weakness, assumed fear, assumed compliance. He had no idea who she was, what she had inherited, or the fire that could rise from a heart betrayed. Clara stood slowly, each movement deliberate, her fingers brushing the envelope on the floor. The divorce papers were more than ink and paper. They were a challenge, an insult, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. And for the first time, she did not feel powerless. The life she had believed was fragile, the ordinary existence she thought could be taken, was about to reveal depths he could never have imagined. Mark continued, oblivious to the storm brewing within her. "I always knew you were hiding something," he said, leaning closer, "but I never thought it'd be enough to matter." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her pulse a drumbeat of defiance. Enough to matter. Yes, she would show him exactly what that meant. The betrayal had been calculated, cruel, and public in the privacy of their living room. Yet the fire within her, fueled by injustice and rage, was awakening. Clara took a slow, steadying breath, her mind racing through possibilities, strategies, and consequences. She would not crumble. She would not beg. And as Mark sipped his coffee, smug and self-satisfied, he had no inkling that the next move would be hers, and it would change everything. The room was silent now, except for the faint ticking of a clock that seemed to mock her. Clara sank onto the couch, the divorce papers lying beside her like a weight she could not lift. The warmth of Christmas, once comforting, now felt like an empty echo. The lights twinkled, indifferent to her pain, and the scent of pine seemed almost cruel, a reminder of the joy she had lost. Tears slid down her cheeks unbidden, tracing paths of betrayal and heartbreak. Mark had not only rejected her, he had humiliated her at the moment she was most vulnerable, at the time meant for love and celebration. The man she had trusted, the one who had promised to protect and cherish her, had chosen mockery over compassion. Every memory of him now stung with bitterness, every shared dream shattered into fragments too sharp to touch without bleeding. Alone, she felt the depth of her isolation. Friends and family were far away, the world outside unaware of the cruelty inflicted behind closed doors. She had carried her secret inheritance quietly, believing it irrelevant in her ordinary life. But now, stripped of the comfort of companionship, stripped of trust, The enormity of her mother's fortune pressed against her mind, both a burden and a potential lifeline. Her fingers lingered on the envelope her mother had left behind, a reminder that beneath the despair there was power. A life-altering secret waiting silently, like a spark buried beneath ashes. For the first time, Clara realized that her suffering was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Yet the emotional weight was overwhelming. Each breath felt heavy, each thought tangled with grief and disbelief. How could someone so close betray her with such precision? How could the life she had imagined, one of safety, love, and simplicity, be upended so brutally? She felt small, fragile, and frightened, the vulnerability of her pregnancy amplifying every fear. And still, amid the sorrow, a subtle current of resolve stirred. Her mother's life, her carefully hidden fortune, had been built on foresight, discretion, and quiet strength. If Clara could find even a fraction of that courage, she could transform this moment of despair into a turning point. The injustice she faced, the cruelty she endured, could become fuel for something greater than she had ever dared imagine. Her tears slowed, replaced by a trembling clarity. The weight of betrayal remained, but it no longer paralyzed her entirely. In the stillness, she sensed the first glimmer of power, the knowledge that she was no longer truly alone. Her mother's legacy, the life she had inherited, was a secret strength that even Mark could not touch. Clara drew a deep, shuddering breath, letting the sting of pain mingle with the seed of determination. The journey ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time, she felt a quiet certainty that she could rise, reclaim, and transform everything. The question was no longer whether she could endure. She had to decide how she would strike back. Clara sat at the edge of her mother's desk, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. Inside were papers that seemed ordinary at first glance, letters, documents, account numbers. But as she sifted through them, the truth began to unfold in staggering clarity. Her mother's fortune was no longer a whispered rumor, no mere shadow of possibility. It was real, vast beyond comprehension, and now it was entirely hers. The numbers on the balance sheets were almost meaningless in their scale. Accounts spanning continents, investments in technologies and enterprises that shaped entire industries, holdings in lands and properties that most could only dream of. This was wealth beyond imagination. But alongside the raw figures were strategies, instructions, and contacts. Trusted advisors, discreet legal experts, philanthropic channels. Her mother had not only accumulated this wealth, she had orchestrated a network of influence, carefully hidden, yet meticulously organized. Clara's mind raced, trying to reconcile the ordinary life she had known with the empire now revealed. Every small moment of struggle, every day she had thought of as humble and constrained, had been lived in parallel with extraordinary power. She thought of Mark, smug and dismissive, believing he held the upper hand. He had no inkling of the life she was about to command. Her fingers traced the ledgers again, absorbing not just the sums, but the implications. She could fund projects to save lives, create opportunities for the marginalized, and wield influence in ways that could shift economies. But even more intoxicating was the realization of the personal power she now possessed. Her mother had left her not just wealth, but freedom, the ability to protect herself, to make choices unbound by fear, and to confront betrayal on her own terms. Clara's heart pounded, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and rising anticipation. She could feel the first flush of empowerment, a surge that replaced despair with determination. Every document was a key, every contact a potential ally, every instruction a roadmap to leverage a life that had once seemed impossible. The scale of what she now commanded was overwhelming, but beneath the shock lay a seed of clarity. This power was hers to use, wisely, strategically, deliberately. The implications for Mark were immediate. The man who had mocked her, dismissed her, and filed for divorce at her most vulnerable moment had underestimated her entirely. He thought he had stripped her of control, but in reality, he had only delayed the awakening of her true strength. The ordinary life he believed he dominated was now a chessboard, and Clara, armed with fortune, influence, and foresight, was poised to move first. Her thoughts flickered between possibilities. How could she safeguard her child? How could she reclaim dignity and justice? How could she confront cruelty without compromising herself? The answers were not simple, but the potential was exhilarating. She felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also the thrill of agency, the rare, almost intoxicating power of someone who holds both the means and the right to change the course of their life. As she stared at the final documents, a photograph slipped from the stack. It was her mother, smiling quietly, eyes full of secret knowledge, as if she had anticipated this moment and trusted Clara to rise to it. Clara's lips pressed into a determined line. The tears of betrayal were drying. In their place, a fire burned. The journey ahead was fraught with risk, but Clara now understood one undeniable truth. She was no longer powerless. She was no longer the frightened, betrayed woman her husband had tried to dominate. She was heir to an empire, guardian of a legacy, and the quiet storm that would reshape her world had already begun to gather strength. Somewhere beyond the walls of her ordinary apartment, Mark believed he had won. He had no idea that the life he thought he controlled had already slipped through his fingers, and that Clara, armed with secret wealth and unstoppable resolve, was preparing for the reckoning he could never anticipate. Clara leaned over the sprawling documents her mother had left, a quiet determination settling in her chest. The grief and shock that had once weighed her down had shifted, replaced by clarity. She understood that power without strategy was chaos, and if she intended to reclaim her life, protect her child, and confront the man who had humiliated her, she would need precision, patience, and cunning. Her first step was observation. She began cataloging Mark's patterns, noting his arrogance, his assumptions, and the vulnerabilities that had always been hidden beneath his polished exterior. The divorce papers, once a symbol of shame, became a blueprint for his expectations. He believed she was weak, compliant, and desperate, and that miscalculation would be the foundation of her plan. Next came the alliances. Using her mother's network of trusted advisors, lawyers, and discreet contacts, Clara quietly established lines of support. Each call, each meeting was cloaked in anonymity, but each one reinforced her emerging strategy. She learned which banks, which corporations, and which legal entities could be leveraged in her favor. Every conversation revealed opportunities, weaknesses in systems, and avenues for influence that Mark would never anticipate. Clara's planning was meticulous. She envisioned a timeline that balanced patience with action. Public confrontation would not come first. It would be carefully orchestrated, poetic in its timing, and devastating in its impact. She imagined him confident and smug, unaware of the storm gathering silently behind the scenes. Every asset she controlled, every influence she could wield, became a tool, a thread in a web designed to ensnare the arrogance of a man who had underestimated her completely. She also considered the personal stakes, the child growing within her, the innocence that demanded protection. Every action she planned accounted for safety, discretion, and resilience. Her mother's fortune was more than wealth. It was armor, a shield that could deflect both legal battles and emotional assaults. Clara envisioned homes secured, identities protected, and contingencies in place for any attempt by Mark to manipulate or interfere. As the hours passed, Clara felt a quiet thrill. The once timid, betrayed woman was evolving into a strategist, a force who could bend systems, people, and circumstances to her will. She imagined subtle interventions, contracts that shifted leverage, discreet acquisitions that changed power dynamics, legal maneuvers that would leave Mark exposed without ever revealing her full hand. The anticipation of watching the man who had mocked her confront consequences, he could not escape became a potent motivator. She paused at a photograph of her mother, eyes full of quiet pride and secret knowledge. It was as if the woman had anticipated this moment, had instilled in Clara not just the tools of wealth, but the mindset of an empress ready to reclaim her sovereignty. Clara drew a deep breath, feeling a surge of confidence she had never known before. The fire within her was no longer reactive. It was deliberate, measured, and unyielding. Every night, she reviewed her plan, adjusting variables, imagining Mark's reactions, considering the ripple effects. She envisioned confrontations that would seem accidental yet precise, interventions that appeared coincidental but were anything but. Every detail mattered: the timing of announcements, the sequence of financial maneuvers, the messaging to allies and adversaries alike. Her mind became a chessboard, Mark a piece unknowingly maneuvered toward his own downfall. Yet even in her strategic planning, Clara allowed herself a moment of reflection. She remembered the pain, the humiliation, and the vulnerability of the Christmas morning betrayal. Those memories, once paralyzing, now fueled a quiet satisfaction. Justice, she realized, would not be loud or chaotic. It would be methodical, elegant, and undeniable. And when the day came, the reckoning would feel both inevitable and irreversible. As she closed the final folder for the night, Clara felt the first true sense of empowerment she had ever known. The darkness of betrayal had been replaced with clarity, the helplessness of despair with actionable strength. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and the storm she had begun to orchestrate would not just confront Mark, it would dismantle the arrogance that had once sought to define her life. The question now was no longer whether she could act, but when. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, Clara knew that the day of reckoning was approaching, and the man who had underestimated her would soon discover the consequences of his cruelty. Mark's confident stride faltered the moment he entered the room. Clara stood near the window, back straight, eyes calm yet piercing, a subtle glow of authority surrounding her. The envelope of divorce papers he had so arrogantly thrust at her months ago now seemed laughable, almost insignificant, in the presence of the woman she had once believed powerless. What is all this?" he stammered, eyes darting to the documents laid neatly on the table. Financial ledgers, corporate agreements, property holdings, and correspondence with influential figures worldwide. Each sheet was a testament to power he had never imagined existed. His smirk, once an emblem of dominance, faltered, replaced by a creeping panic. Clara's lips curved into a faint, controlled smile. "This is what you underestimated," she said softly, her voice steady. "You thought I was weak, that I'd crumble at your cruelty. You were wrong." Mark swallowed hard, disbelief clouding his features. He tried to assert control, to reach for the arrogance that had once defined him. "Clara, I don't understand. Where did all this come from? How?" Her calm was deliberate, strategic. "My mother's life, her fortune, her network, it's mine now. Every resource, every connection, every asset. You thought you had the upper hand, but this world, Mark, it doesn't belong to you. And it never did." He stumbled backward, clutching at the edge of the table, a feeble attempt to regain composure. "But I thought—" His voice trailed into silence, the gravity of the revelation anchoring him in a moment of helplessness he had never known. Clara's eyes never left his. She didn't shout, she didn't rage. She allowed the power in her calmness to speak. The irony was intoxicating. He had tormented her, mocked her, and underestimated the depth of her strength, and now, in a room filled with proof of her newfound influence, he could do nothing. The audience, fully aware of the empire she commanded, witnessed a man stripped of his illusions, scrambling futilely against the tide of consequence. Mark's attempts to negotiate, to manipulate, to charm, faltered spectacularly. Every plea for understanding, every feigned display of guilt, was met with precise, measured responses. Clara had anticipated his moves, planned for every argument, every tactic he could muster. He tried to appeal to emotion, invoking memories of shared history, but each sentiment only highlighted the contrast between his arrogance and her deliberate composure. "You really believed cruelty would last," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a weight that anchored the room. "You mistook my silence for weakness. You mistook your control for inevitability, but everything you relied on to dominate me, it was never yours to hold." Mark's face paled, sweat beaded at his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it, words failing. The realization was devastating. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Every asset, every connection, every influence he had ever assumed he could manipulate was now under her command. The arrogance that had fueled him was dissolving into panic and regret. Clara's gaze softened briefly, a nod to the past they had shared, but it quickly hardened with purpose. "The choices I make from here will protect my child, preserve my dignity, and ensure that cruelty is never rewarded." Mark sank into the chair he had once occupied with such certainty, powerless in ways he had never imagined. The confrontation was complete, not with a shout, not with a storm, but with precision, strategy, and revelation. Clara had reclaimed control, and the man who had once dictated the terms of her life now understood, too late, that the game had changed entirely. The room, once charged with tension and fear for Clara, now radiated her quiet triumph. The reckoning had arrived, and the consequences were irrevocable. Mark's shock was total, absolute, and in that moment the balance of power had shifted forever. In the quiet that followed the confrontation, Clara felt a profound shift within herself. The adrenaline of strategy, the intoxicating taste of reclaimed power, gradually gave way to reflection. The woman who had once trembled in fear, who had felt crushed by betrayal and loneliness, now recognized a deeper truth. Her strength had never come from wealth or influence alone. It had always been rooted in resilience, clarity, and the unwavering love she carried for her unborn child. She considered the journey that had brought her here, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the cruel Christmas morning, and the shock of discovery. Each moment had been a teacher, a trial by fire that forced her to confront vulnerability and emerge with purpose. She realized that forgiveness, not for Mark's sake, but for her own, was essential. Holding on to rage would only tether her to the past, while letting go allowed her to claim the freedom she deserved. Clara began setting boundaries, not as an act of retaliation, but as a declaration of self-worth. She acknowledged that some doors must remain closed, some relationships too toxic to salvage. Her mother's legacy had taught her that power was most potent when wielded responsibly, and that included protecting her energy, her values, and her emotional integrity. The empathy she carried was no longer a weakness, it was a compass guiding her decisions. Her inner transformation was visible even in the smallest acts. The way she moved through her home, the calm assurance in her voice, the deliberate way she planned her day around priorities rather than fear. She understood that true justice was not only about external reckoning, but about the peace she cultivated within herself. The power she inherited was a tool, yes, but the real triumph was her ability to balance strength with grace, strategy with morality, and ambition with compassion. Clara also embraced the responsibility of shaping the world her child would inherit. She envisioned a life of protection, of opportunity, and of lessons imparted through example. That resilience is forged in adversity, that integrity outweighs cruelty, and that self-respect is a force stronger than any external power. In this, she discovered joy, not the fleeting satisfaction of revenge, but the enduring fulfillment of self-realization. The transformation was complete when she no longer felt the need to justify her worth to anyone, including the man who had once sought to diminish her. Her narrative was hers to write. The wealth, influence, and strategic acumen were extensions of a spirit that had always been capable, but now fully awakened. Clara recognized that moral redemption was not about absolving wrongs, but about transcending them, and in doing so, she created a space where justice and compassion coexisted. As she held her belly, feeling the gentle stir of life inside, Clara smiled, not at victory over another, but at the profound realization that she had reclaimed herself. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, purpose, and a heart fortified by experience. She was no longer defined by betrayal or fear. She was defined by courage, wisdom, and the unwavering commitment to live with dignity and love. And in that quiet strength, she found the ultimate redemption, the power to create a life shaped by choice, not circumstance. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the room where Clara now sat, her hands resting gently on her growing belly. The storm of betrayal, manipulation, and heartbreak had passed, leaving a calm forged from resilience and wisdom. Mark, once so certain of control, now faced the consequences of his arrogance. Legal battles, social exposure, and the quiet dismantling of his influence ensured that he could no longer dictate her life. The poetic justice was subtle yet absolute. He remained free in body, but shackled by the repercussions of his own choices, a mirror of the pain he had inflicted. Clara's world, in contrast, radiated security, empowerment, and hope. Her mother's fortune, her carefully cultivated network, and the strategic plans she had set in motion ensured that her child would grow in a world of opportunity and safety. The fear that had once gripped her heart had been replaced by a steady confidence, a knowledge that she was capable of protecting, nurturing, and shaping the life of the little one who would soon arrive. She walked through her home, once modest and quiet, now imbued with the invisible presence of power and foresight. Every object, every space carried the legacy of generations, the wisdom of her mother, and the strength of her own journey. Clara understood that peace was not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment between values, purpose, and action. The past remained, but it no longer dictated her choices. It had become a foundation upon which she could build a life defined by courage and compassion. As she looked out the window at the world beyond, streets bustling with life, neighbors unaware of the quiet revolution she had orchestrated, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude. The lessons of betrayal had transformed her, the cruelty she endured had sharpened her judgment, and the inheritance she had discovered had given her tools to manifest justice without losing herself in vengeance. She smiled, not at retribution, but at the clarity and balance she had achieved. Her thoughts drifted to the child growing within her. Every kick, every flutter was a reminder of continuity, of hope, and of the enduring strength that could rise from even the deepest despair. Clara vowed to raise her child in a world where integrity, courage, and empathy mattered more than wealth or power, teaching the lessons she had learned. That resilience could triumph over cruelty, that justice could be delivered with grace, and that self-worth was the greatest inheritance one could possess. The room filled with light, both literal and metaphorical, signaling the start of a new chapter. Clara, once betrayed and vulnerable, now stood as a figure of quiet authority and profound compassion. The past was reconciled, the present secure, and the future luminous. And in that delicate balance of justice and hope, she realized that life could offer not only reprisal but also redemption, not only closure but also inspiration. Somewhere in the stillness, a single thought lingered, a subtle echo of triumph and possibility. The world could be cruel, but it could also be beautiful. And she, now fully awakened, would navigate it on her own terms, leaving a legacy of strength, love, and hope for generations to come.